So I'd like to just define a couple of terms because I will be talking about slightly different things here. I think that it's most of my career and what I do on a day-to-day basis is under the banner of helping people improve their health span. This is really an understanding that what we're trying to do is to make sure that the period of being healthy in your life is extended for as long as you possibly can. And that in its own right would mean things like, what is your family history of chronic diseases, heart disease and diabetes, and whether or not there's cancer in the family or dementia or blood pressure, polycystic ovarian syndrome. Knowing your own health and saying, these are my risks. How do I delay the onset of these diseases? How do I, if I have it, how do I manage it better? Is it possible to even reverse it? Is it possible to never have them happen in the first place? And so the idea of delaying the onset of chronic disease, that's what I be and I talk about with people and build plans on all the time. Then, as I said, with respect to health span, it's looking at your physical health and how do you preserve it through your lifetime. What's important at 30 might be different at 50 and then again at 70, but we have to carry our bodies. Then we're protecting and nurturing our mental health. And if we do all of these things and you're lucky, there's a very, very good chance that most people should be able to live, really quite healthy up until your 90s. So this is health span. But this is where I want to diverge a little bit. Today, I actually want to talk about lifespan itself and longevity itself. So obviously, it's a good thing to try to live healthier, but could you live healthier and longer? And that's sort of the icing on the cake. So this then means that we need to look at aging independent of all those other things that I said. What are the factors that make us age that's not always linked to the development of disease and physical decline? What about actual aging itself? And so this is actually an emerging area of science and medicine, and that's what people are looking for. And this is the idea of actually what would you be able to do to extend your life by 10 years or 15 years or 40 years or something like that. And because of it, it's theoretical and it's experimental. We don't have firm information on this, but that's what I want to talk about today is the process of aging. What do we know about aging? Where are the hints as to what it is that we could actually do on a practical basis day to day, but what's coming? And I suppose a nice way to think about this is if we work hard on making sure or improving our health span, then we don't know what's going to happen in 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 years with respect to medicine and science. But if our bodies are physically capable, if our mind is in the right place, if we're healthy enough, maybe we're going to be in a better position to respond and to have access to some of these treatments as time passes. So by preserving our health, we're buying time. And honestly, who could say what the next 10 or 15 years is going to bring in the sphere of longevity? We look at companies like Google, which now have a bigger company called Alphabet. They have a subsidiary company called Calico. They have $1 billion invested in longevity research. It's the tech companies. There are people interested in this and they're funding it. And ultimately that will come and be there for us. So how do we really define then aging? So the first way to, if we want to put an actual definition to it, okay, it's as I've got here. I just need to move a few things. But it's the time, so it's the time-dependent functional decline that affects most living organisms. So as time passes, our functions slowly but surely decline. And an easy way to just think about that is if we just look at our skin. Okay, as time passes, we can see aging doing what it does with our skin. We lose our elasticity. The plumpness of the skin is no longer the same. We can see it. We see it as we look in the mirrors as to what is happening. So, but what's causing that? This isn't a disease at this point. What is causing the aging process to occur, and what can we do about it? And what we need to know is that as our body is assaulted by ultraviolet radiation and the foods that we eat and the toxins that we have and the wear and tear, our bodies have got mechanisms in there to try to compensate for it and try to restore this balance. But as time passes, it becomes a slow but sure losing battle. But it's in these sorts of places that the scientists are looking to say, well, what are the mechanisms? If we can understand these mechanisms, how do we slow them down? How do we reverse them? These mechanisms of compensation are not just one. They're all interconnected. We need to know what those interconnections are. We need to be able to identify what are the interventions that we're going to need to do to actually slow down that aging process. But if we want to know the interventions, we have to understand aging and almost call aging a disease in its own right that's happening at the same time as all these other health conditions are occurring. One of the big problems that scientists have, and the arguments that we see in the research, is we don't really have very good markers for aging itself. So when you do some sort of intervention and you test for it, how do we know that you actually have slowed down that aging process or reversed the aging process? This biological marker, we don't really have strong markers for yet. As I go through the talk today, I'll show you some of the markers that are being used. And these are markers that we have access to, but they change over time. And I can guarantee you in 2 or 3 years, if I was to give a similar talk, these markers will be a little different again. So here comes the science. In 2013, a very, very prominent journal called Cell produced a groundbreaking article that really highlighted what we think are some of the major hallmarks of aging at this point in time. So there has been a lot of research on this topic, and the body of knowledge continues to improve and expand, but a large group of people got together and condensed these all. Now, they came up with 9 hallmarks of aging, and I'm going to talk about each one of those today, but just in small little snippets. Now, I think there are some more hallmarks now that have come, and then I think these really do form the base of a lot of research. And I think today, if all of us get a bit of an idea of these hallmarks, you're going to get this picture, and then you'll be able to decide perhaps what things you might want to do or to think about. So some things that we know is that these things happen as part of the normal aging process. So these aren't disease states. This is just what happens as aging. All of these things, these 9 terms that I've got here up on the left, are very much interconnected. They're not individual entities. And what we like the idea of thinking is, if you aggravate any one of these, I'll pick the first one. If you make your genetic system more unstable, that then should increase the aging process. decrease your health span. But then again, if you're doing experimental work and you block it, then we would expect that we see aging to slow down and health span to increase. But like I said, we don't have very good markers for that. But that's what you need to do. If you're going to do experiments on the aging process, then you need to be able to block it. You need to be able to exacerbate it. So let's talk about each one of these a little bit. So, and I think a good way to do it is you just start from the fundamental building blocks. So let's start small and build up. So the first one really comes under the banner of cellular damage. Okay, as we get older, there is damage occurring to our cells. The most basic building block of our cells is our DNA, which codes for our life. It codes for everything. So what we understand, so that's our genes. What we know is that our genes, our DNA code, our string of base pairs of DNA is inherently quite unstable because every time a cell divides, our genome, our DNA is being replicated. And there's also assaults to the system constantly. We're bombarded by UV radiation. We eat toxic foods. We breathe in the air, and there are all these things having an impact. So what we know is that there is 10,000, 100,000 what we call genetic lesions occurring on our DNA all the time, every day. And whether we have a lack of sleep, how much alcohol we consume, what kind of chemicals come into our system, what sort of assault by various viruses have we had, what kind of biological agents have we had access to. All of these things are contributing to this genetic instability. And so we also have internal threats. Our own DNA, when it's replicating, makes mistakes. And so that's happening independent of whatever external factor that is occurring. And so our bodies and our systems have got very, very complex systems involved to repair our DNA. We have got very, very good, very effective DNA repair mechanisms. But what we know is when those mechanisms start to not form well, or not do their job well, accelerating aging is the result. So there are scientists who are very, very interested in it right at this level. And so what I kind of want to do today is just maybe throw out some names, for example, and people who are then interested, even simple Google searches will take you to these places. And also, even if you just get the names of a few interesting compounds or supplements, you'll go, oh, that's where it fits into this big picture. So there is a well-known doctor called Dr. David Sinclair. He's got a book on longevity, and he has a real interest in these compounds, NADH, NMR, NMN, all this particular kind of area of compound we know reduces DNA damage. And so people buy supplements that contain these compounds under the idea that it might help them slow down aging. And this is a very, very interesting area of science. It's very much a research tool, but it has also filtered its way out into the mainstream, and there are commercial products. So all I'm saying today is that you can start to look at somebody like Dr. Sinclair. You can type in things like NMR or NMN and anti-aging, and you can see what kind of studies are starting to come out and what is happening, and make informed decisions. But we can look right at that DNA level. A lot of people might have already heard about something called telomere shortening. So as I've said, and again, these are all linked. So when you have DNA damage occurring as time passes, a lot of the time, the damage to the DNA is occurring in random areas. But there are some areas of our chromosomes, such as the ends of our chromosomes, that are really susceptible to DNA damage. So telomeres are the caps at the end of our chromosomes. And every single time our cells divide, the telomeres shorten just a little bit. And then once they achieve a certain shortness, then the DNA starts to tangle, and then the cell now is what's called a non-viable cell. Well, if you can imagine, an accumulation of non-viable cells is going to, in fact, have an impact on our bodies and our organs and our systems and our aging. So scientists have been thinking, well, if we can see telomere shortening, does that tell us a little bit about to what extent are we aging? Can you improve or extend your telomere length? So that might now become a therapy. How do I extend my telomeres, or what kind of changes can I make? And can I measure my actual telomeres and the length of my telomeres? And there is a big market in support supplements that do all of this. But I also think we need to think very carefully here. There's this sort of fine line. When telomeres can get too long, there's links with that to cancer. And so the idea of manipulating telomere length through chemical means or supplemental means, I don't understand this area well enough, but we do need to tread carefully and think a little bit. So is our biological age, how our age is going, measured by telomere length? So when I first moved to Singapore, that was one of the commercial tools that we had. So I went and had my telomeres. You can do a test, paid money. At that point, I think I was 51 years old. And by telomere length, I was biologically significantly younger. It felt good. It was nice. But again, what we've now noted is that people do 6-month changes in lifestyle or supplement or diet, and they see their telomere length extend. And the question that a lot of longevity doctors would say, well, have you really slowed down the aging process to such an extent by just making these lifestyle changes over a 6-month point? Or does the telomere length move perhaps a little more than we would think? And do we actually need or think about better markers, because this one is just getting manipulated and moved too quickly? But it's interesting, and it might be directionally interesting to know this information. Then again, if we keep on thinking, so I've spoken about damage to the DNA strands itself, locations of multiple breaks of DNA at the telomere length, but we can still look further when it comes to to our DNA. Our chromosomes, our DNA is wound and wound and wound up. And if you can imagine, every single cell of our body has got our entire genetic components sitting in that cell. How do we know which genes get switched on and which genes get switched off in that cell? Why does a liver cell operate differently from a muscle cell? And what we know is the DNA unravels, and there are these little markers on top of the DNA that allows chemicals to come in and switch on certain genes and switch off certain genes. And so these markers that sit on top are called our epigenome. So again, today I'm just wanting to introduce terms to you. So when people talk about the epigenome, it's literally these tags that sit on top of our genome, on top of our DNA. And what we've discovered is that as time passes, we have what's called epigenetic drift. These tags start to move in a particular way, and as a result, our cells may then not switch on the genes the way they're meant to, as they would have done years gone by, this thing called epigenetic drift. And so again, scientists are talking about, can you actually find ways to get the tags to not drift or to reset the tags? It's a really, really interesting area of research, and it's getting closer to some of the real markers that we have, or the next round of markers that we have of actually aging. Because you can have a look at your own DNA and you can look at those tags and you can see to what extent are they drifting away from where they should be for your age. There are, again, because I wanted to introduce terms and chemicals that you may have heard or read about, but people have spoken about resveratrol as being this anti-aging product. Well, resveratrol contains these things called sirtuins, and they can affect these tags, these methylation patterns and tags. So this is where the thought of resveratrol, which, by the way, you can get from food as well, from the skin of grape, by taking resveratrol, are you able to manipulate your epigenetic tags and to have them placed in the way that they should be? So David Sinclair has a book called Lifespan, and he talks about this, and he talks about the kinds of ideas that he has for therapies in the future where we might be able to reset our epigenome and reset the clock on that front. So I always like to put myself on the chopping block. So this was probably the most recent test that I've done for myself. So there are commercial tests where you can find out what is your methylation patterns, your epigenetic tags for you. And time has passed, I'm getting a little older. So at 55 years old, my epigenetic tag is telling me that I'm at 49. So I think I was 10 years younger biologically from the telomere test. This one's catching up a little bit, but again, put a smile on my face. So let's get a little bit bigger again. So what does DNA do? DNA codes for all the proteins that our bodies need, and our proteins are the functional units that make up our hormones and create the structures for our skin and send all the signals for all of the chemical reactions that are occurring and are the building blocks. So the hormones, our structure, everything. And what we know is that, again, we get a decline in the quality of our protein as time passes. Our proteins have got these three-dimensional shapes and they fold in particular ways. And if they don't fold the right way and their shape isn't right, that whole system of shapes, which really is how our bodies and our systems work, don't work quite so well. So there's this huge area of what's called proteomics. And they're saying, well, this is where we need to be looking. And so our bodies, again, have got control mechanisms on how to preserve the stability and the function of our proteins. And we've got systems in our body to get rid of proteins that aren't folding well, okay, and aren't functioning well. And so again, I want to introduce terms. You may have heard or read about something called autophagy, and it's a name and it's a word that we see in longevity medicine, because autophagy is one of our body's systems in order to rid ourselves of proteins that are now not working appropriately. It's a spring cleaning mechanism. And we have understood that restricting calories and periods of fasting can, what we believe, may turn on autophagy. But again, it's difficult to measure this. We don't have a good marker to measure it. But again, it's this interesting area of science, and I just wanted people to get these terms today. We also know that there are these things called heat shock proteins that can sometimes help restore or preserve that stability of the folding of the proteins. And heat shock proteins occur can be increased in number and to be sort of mobilized by the body when we put ourselves under sort of duress, like hot saunas. So when you look at longevity medicine, quite often you'll see there's a lot of studies being done on hot saunas and the benefits of hot saunas. And what's their mechanism? It's the induction of these heat shock proteins that then in turn may have an impact on the folding of our protein. So it's interesting. Diseases like Alzheimer's disease, where we have beta amyloid and tau proteins misfolded. This is where we can sort of see a functional effect of misfolded proteins and what is the result. So, you know, are you able to offset the progression of dementia through hot sauna or other ways to stimulate heat shock proteins? So I'm trying to keep it easy, even though the graphs on the left-hand side look complicated. So the next one is moving up the chain again. So we go from proteins to nutrients. How does our body sense the nutrients that are coming in and make sure that we do the right things with the nutrients that we have? Because we know that if we get our nutrient intake wrong, or as time passes, how our bodies deal with various nutrients, we can have health conditions occur, excessive weight gain, insulin resistance, metabolic diseases, the diabetes. All of these things quite often end up being issues in the way we sense nutrients. And what we know, unfortunately, is as time passes, the control of these nutrient sensing systems also decline. And again, I'm just wanting to give names, okay? Insulin and insulin-like growth factor. It's a signaling pathway that's involved with how we metabolize glucose, sugars, okay, and how we deal with it. When that pathway gets dysregulated, we all know where that leads us. It leads us down the path of insulin resistance and diabetes. There is another name which called the mTOR pathway. You'll see or you'll hear that with other people talking to you about longevity or longevity medicine. And the mTOR pathway, that senses our amino acids, the proteins that we have, and it can measure excessive amounts of protein that is coming in, and that our proteins and our building of muscle and the production of hormones, whether we have things occurring that's anabolic and producing growth or catabolic and creating breakdown. We need those things happening at certain points of times in our lives and not happening at other points of times in our lives. As we get older and we have more circulating cancer cells, we might not want to be in a position of trying to make more cells occur and to be building. We have another thing called AMPK that senses when we're in a low energy state. And you will have heard, or you've had other people talking about the concept of calorie restriction and longer life, fasting and longer life. Well, why is that happening? It's happening because it activates this AMPK system. And again, we may be in a position over time to manipulate these nutrient sensing systems. So there's interesting studies happening. COVID slowed something down, but there's a study called the TAMES study in the United States, which is for the first time looking at a medication, metformin, and seeing, is this medication actually something that could extend people's lives? And it's how it's operating through, so one of its mechanisms could be through nutrient sensing and the AMPK pathway. And again, I'm just giving names today. Rapamycin is an immunosuppressant medication that that transplant patients take, but different doses of it are now looking very, very interesting as a potential anti-aging tool. Very, very much in the research side of things. But why does rapamycin work? It inhibits mTOR. So we're getting closer to understanding the mechanisms possibly of aging and therapeutics for it. Then as we keep on that nutrient side of it, well, when we get nutrients coming into our body, where do they go? And how do we ultimately get energy from them? Well, our mitochondria, which are the powerhouse, the batteries of all our cells, and each of our cells, certain cells have far more mitochondria than others, because this is where the carbohydrates that we consume and the fats that we consume and the oxygen that we breathe all come together to produce the electrical energy and the heat that allows us to do all of the chemical reactions of our body and to exist and to live. So a huge area of science is dedicated towards, well, are our batteries slowly but surely declining as time passes? And absolutely. What we note is that mitochondrial decline does occur, and it's a marker of our aging. So can we do things to preserve our mitochondria and allow them to work more effectively or to age more slowly? And what we tend to see is that the cells that really have a lot of mitochondria, ones that have a body cells that have a real need for a lot of energy, these are the ones that we start to see the decline in sooner. So decline in the brain, decline in the heart disease and dementia, one of the big four of chronic diseases that are going to ultimately take our lives. So we can measure mitochondrial decline in a laboratory. We can start to do interventions on how to improve mitochondrial function. And this is where exercise comes in. There is a really interesting form of exercise called zone 2 exercise, where you exercise at a particular heart rate. But when we talk about longevity and the things that we can currently do, and we look at the science, your best drug that you have access to at the moment is exercise as a way of extending lifespan, not just health span, but longevity itself. So investing time in that is important. You've all seen my age now. I'm 55 years old. I made the decision recently. I have a sit-down desk job. I actually should be doing some kind of exercise every day. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a difficult type of exercise, but there's this concept of having an exercise portfolio for your age group and for what it is that you want to be doing as time passes. What is the kind of exercise that's most appropriate for you? Well, certainly looking into and understanding zone 2 exercise, and again, I'll leave you to that, or I can come back and give talks on any one of these parts. But understanding zone 2 exercise and applying it might have an impact on mitochondria, mitochondrial efficiency, and again, helping to preserve your longevity. Then we keep on going, okay? There's this term called cellular senescence. Our cells are constantly dividing, and our body is replacing cells all over and over and over. And that cell cycle, okay, when that in itself slowly but surely has more mistakes, more DNA damage, the telomere shortening that we're talking about. What eventually happens is damaged cells themselves are very high risk of becoming cancerous cells. And so our body has already got good mechanisms built in called cellular senescence to inactivate these cells. It's basically saying your body has a signal that says these cells are not operating well. Let's stop the cell division and let's just keep them there indefinitely. Okay, but as we think about it, as we get older, maybe those more and more of those cells are not functioning well, and then the organ itself isn't functioning well, or the system itself isn't functioning well. And so maybe what happens is as we get older, that turnover of senescent cells isn't as efficient as it had been. And then also our body's ability to regenerate and have new cells, the stem cell regeneration that we talk about, isn't happening to the extent that we need to extend our lives. And so this area of what we call cellular senescence is a very, very interesting field of longevity science. And so then linked to that is if we don't have the ability to regenerate cells as well, then we have this exhaustion, and the stem cells that are responsible for regeneration, them in themselves becoming exhausted. You would all know, or many would know, that the skincare industry loves to talk to us about the stem cells and the products that we can buy that are going to allow stem cell regeneration, so that you are seeing it. Am I actually rejuvenating my skin and actually producing new fresh cells? And there I am looking for far more healthy. Well, can that be done internally at an organ level, for example? But once we get to the point where the stem cells themselves are exhausted, okay, maybe this is when all of these markers that I've spoken to you about aging are starting to accumulate and show itself. Because now we're seeing not just DNA damage, but it's tissue damage and organ damage and organism, our body, total body damage. So of course, this world of stem cell rejuvenation is an area of medicine, of longevity science that has a huge amount of potential. What we know, again, is fasting and fast mimicking diets may end up having an impact on stem cell regeneration. Again, very, very early, interesting information. And then the last one is literally, as I said, our cells have to be able to communicate with each other. Our hormones need to be able to communicate with each other. Our nerves need to accumulate to communicate with each other. And that communication between all of these if you have a breakdown of it, the system breaks down. And one thing that we know is that when we talk about global communication, inflammation can dysregulate it. And so, again, I want to introduce a term called inflammaging. It's this idea that a slow and steady inflammation of our internal system will slowly but surely impact our communication, and is one of the markers of a lot of our diseases. And in fact, that's very much true. Heart disease is very much a disease of inflammation of our arteries and then all of the products that occur with it. Diabetes in a similar situation. Ditto with the brain, ditto with cancer. So looking at the concept of inflammation and what can you do about it. And we can think about, and I can talk on another talk about an anti-inflammatory eating pattern, for example. And so there are things that we can do here. So what's important? What are the tools that we have today on a longevity front? Okay, so don't smoke. Okay, if we look at the top and we talk about chemicals, for example, that we can ingest that are going to be linked right at that DNA level. Okay, I just use it as a bit of a reminder. What is it that we can put into our systems that are going to cause us toxicity? So the kinds of foods that we have, the processed foods that we may eat, our exposure to chemicals and to the air, and when Singapore has the haze, making sure that we're covered, because we're going to get access to lots of, possibly very toxic chemicals. It's one place, this barrier. Then there's as I've talked about, knowing where you are from a chronic health perspective. So this is partly the health span side of it. We have good access to blood tests. We know our family history. If you have a history of hypertension, a history of heart disease, if you see your doctors and your doctors are telling you that certain blood markers are on the way up, these are the things to take action on. Because if you're able to slow down the development of a chronic health condition, which is what I talk about many, many times in my talks, you're going to at least extend your health span, and you may help to extend your longevity. Keep your eye out on the pharmaceutical front. So again, from a longevity perspective, not a few more years, but 10 years, 20 years, 30 years of additional life, you're going to see medications being the driver on those fronts, and hearing and knowing about rapamycin and keeping an eye on what happens with this metformin trial and what else is coming. And then there's all these other tools. The dry sauna, nice idea for Singapore, but wow, hard to do. That exercise portfolio that I was talking about, digging in deep, and I normally talk about nutrition. I just think it was nice to talk about something other than nutrition. But all the seminars that I spoke about and the things that people are discussing has a massive impact on our health. We can eat in a heart-healthy manner. You can eat in a way that reduces insulin resistance. We can eat in a manner that helps with cognition. As I'd said, sleep, I've given sleep seminars, and there is just more and more information. But if you want to live a longer life, sleep more, okay, and have good sleeping patterns. And I'd love to talk again on the new things that I've heard from a sleep front. And then, why am I talking to the Brahm Centre people today? It is the mental toolkits that we have, and the Brahm Centre provides some very, very important mental toolkits, whether it's the counseling, whether it is the mindfulness-based meditation courses. Honestly, the learning mindfulness is an incredible way of understanding your mind. If nothing else, practicing mindfulness is a way to examine how your mind works. And many, many people go through an entire lifetime with our whole lives are built through how we see our life through our mind, and we don't even really stop to think, how does our mind work? Mindfulness gives you an opportunity to do that. Every morning when I catch the bus, it's a 20-minute bus ride. That's a 20-minute time for me to do my meditations. You can do it with your eyes open. You can do it with your eyes shut. If you're nice and aware and you have slept well last night, you're not going to miss your bus stop. And it's building those practices in. Where are we at? Where are we on longevity? So women live longer than men. I think this might have changed now, but you can see we have a limit at the moment, and that the real longevity practitioners are talking about step function changes in longevity. How are we going to be in a position to live another 30 or 40 years? But at the moment, where are we? Practice some of the things that I've spoken about. Be lucky. The 90s are achievable for most. Again, scientists are talking about the idea of 10 or 15 additional years. If they were good quality years and you were healthy, that's an interesting proposition. And also the way that society is changing to embrace older people, because we're going to be a part of the workforce. We provide things that younger people don't have, and the idea of actually being a modern elder is really, really interesting, and that we can be very much contributing members to society. So that part as well is wonderful, and hopefully there are Brahm seminars on this front. So thank you so much for listening. I've spoken for nearly an hour and really, really happy to answer questions. So thank you.